world. Though Milken would have known the meeting was scheduled for later that day, and would probably have known its purpose. Shankman added, however, that when the SEC questioned him in connection with this investigation, he was shocked to learn from the government lawyer that Milken had bought these bonds from him, an institutional client, and put them into his personal account. Recalling his days at Lehman Brothers, Shankman said, "At most Wall Street FI-RMS. Certainly at Lehman. You could never have mixed professional and personal that way, buying securities for your account that you were trading for the FI-RM. There's too much opportunity for self-dealing." Somewhat rueful about having made that losing trade, Shankman calculated Milken's Professor IT as $635,500, and remarked, "People work a lifetime and never make that kind of money," and Mike made it in a 3-minute phone conversation. Finally, from the line of questioning at this deposition, it appears that Columbia Savings, First Executive, and the Princeton-Newport Limited Partnership, controlled by James Regan and Edward Thorpe, Milken's partners in Belvedere Securities, the Chicago brokerage firm in which he had the majority interest, may have done well, along with Milken, on the Caesars World Exchange. Milken was asked whether he had had any conversation about the Caesars World bonds with Tom Spiegel, Fred Carr, James Regan or Edward Thorpe between the time of his Caesars meeting and the announcement of the exchange offer about 2 weeks later. Milken testified that he had not. He was also asked if he was familiar with the sale of Caesars World bonds from the Drexel account of Prudential's high-yield fund, decidedly not an inner circle member, to the Columbia Savings account, about a week before the exchange offer was announced. Both accounts were covered by James Dahl, Milken's favored, super-aggressive salesman. Milken said he knew nothing about it. This was the kind of rumor that had swirled around Milken and his inner circle for years. That FI-RST he had created these players such as Spiegel and Carr, made them his captives with their pools of capital at his disposal, and then rewarded them further, sometimes personally. Other bond buyers speculated, with this kind of inside information. Regan and Thorpe were slightly different, insofar as they were not running financial institutions dependent on Milken's junk bonds but were money managers and Milken's partners in some of his lucrative investment partnerships. He could conceivably have Professor Ited directly from rewarding them. At the close of this deposition, when Milken was asked whether he had any knowledge of certain individuals or any interest in certain limited partnerships, which presumably had been buyers of the securities that were the subject of this investigation, one entity about which he was asked was One First National Plaza, Suite 2785, Chicago. The address of at least 2 Milken-Regan-Thorpe partnerships, Belvedere Securities and Dorchester Government Securities. "Don't recognize the name," Milken replied. One former Drexel employee, who was not aware of the Caesars World investigation, commented, "What I think may happen is this. An exchange offer is coming up, and Mike wants it to go well, have a high acceptance rate. So he gets his clients to buy the securities with advance knowledge that there will be an exchange offer in 3 weeks. That way, they all make out. Plus the exchange offer goes through." Even if all this were true, the government could pursue it as they did in Caesars World. But without an informant they would be hard-pressed to make a winning case. For Milken, as for Boesky, in the government's numerous investigations of him, prior to Dennis Levine's turning state's evidence, there was always a credible explanation for his having bought a security. What was telling in interviews with scores who knew Milken, however, was that so many thought he was not above reproach, simply beyond the reach of the law. Some thought that he would violate the securities laws because he had the archetypal outsider's disdain for convention and the established rule, because he believed he was responsive to some higher law. Some thought he would do it because he was increasingly possessed by the machine he had created and would do anything to fuel it. Some thought he would do it because he had the trader's compulsion always to beat his record, and, after 10 years of beating the previous year in a blinding winning streak, there was no way to go on beating it without having an edge. Almost no one, however, thought he would do it out of something as simple and base as avarice. In fact, many who know Milken marvel at how a man of such wealth can remain so indifferent to its usual pleasures. By 1986, a few close to Milken estimated his net worth at $1 billion or more. Moreover, it was said at Drexel that with the help of his brother, Lowell, he had been able to shelter much of it. But Milken was clearly not seduced by the material things his money could buy. For Milken, there was no equivalent of Ivan Boesky's statue garden, or Peltz's Palm Beach Palace, or even Icon's Fox Field. Milken's house in Encino is charming but unprepossessing, no 22-room manor house. It has no surrounding acreage for isolation but sits on a fully developed cul-de-sac where neighborhood children, and probably Milken's own, ride their bicycles up and down. He was said, by one client who visited his home, to have an old 19-inch color TV that was always on the blink, and to have only recently purchased a VCR. His home was decorated with inexpensive wicker furniture, no antiques, no art. Until lately, too, he had driven a dated Oldsmobile. The firm had finally prevailed upon him to get a driver, an insistence that may have been triggered by an auto accident Milken had in 1984, resulting in a lawsuit that he finally settled in the fall of '86 by paying $30,000. Now he owned a Mercedes turbo diesel and had a driver, but the driver was a concession to personal safety, and the antithesis of Milken's style. In another such concession, Milken had recently hired 4 bodyguards. His wife, Lori, who was Milken's high school sweetheart and, according to Steve Wynn, the only girl Milken ever dated, apparently had no greater desire for conspicuous consumption than her husband did. She was said to appear at black tie gatherings, such as those for the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation, the Nazi hunting organization, wearing a cloth coat and inconspicuous jewelry, while other women were swathed in furs and bore rock-sized gems. What Lori Milken did care about, apparently, was writing. It was said to be her consuming interest, and she had been enrolled in various writing workshops over the years. She wrote fiction, mainly short stories, apparently none of which had been published. Milken reportedly offered to buy her a publishing company, something she declined. There seemed to be, then, literally no personal use for the fortune Milken had built. He did contribute in a low-professor-ila way to certain causes, like the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation and, through the Milken Family Foundation, many programs in the field of education, both in California and nationally. But if he was a major philanthropist, that was a well-kept secret. While Milken apparently chose to not spend his money, however, he certainly had been driven to accumulate it from the very start. And, after all these years, he was still trying to shave every trade, still trying to milk his best clients. If we don't make money from our friends, who will we make money from? Still demanding everything but the first-born son in deals where he could get it. And still, in the view of one Drexel employee, shortchanging his partners. Michael has a deal with the firm on every LBO, said this employee. Michael, with his group, gets a piece. The firm gets a piece. A fund that corporate finance has gets a piece. Michael, of course, gets the lion's share. Then Michael goes and tells the client that 10% of the equity has to go to Drexel and 30% has to go to the investors, because they, the investors, need that much to get the proper risk-reward ratio for taking all this subordinated debt. Then he doesn't give the 30% to the investors. He gives maybe 10%. And the other 20% he squirrels away. That, this employee added, has caused tremendous ill will within the firm. Fred Joseph, knew about it, did nothing. It's like, a lot of people will cheat on their income tax. They figure it doesn't hurt anybody but the impersonal government, but not many people will cheat on their friends. In addition to being a talented, creative genius, he concluded, Michael is among the most avaricious, ruthless, venal people on the face of the earth. By 1986, it seemed to some who had known Milken for years that he, always wired, was now like a whirling dervish, spinning out to the very edge of control. One longtime buyer commented that there seemed to be less and less joy in Milken, something that had been part of him in the early years, and more compulsion. Others agreed that he was far more driven than when they had met him in the 70s, though even then he had been one of the most intense and kinetic people they had ever encountered. In a deposition taken during a 1980 SEC investigation, Milken testified that in 1979 he had had about 200 phone conversations on a routine day. Moreover, he added, while he was speaking to someone he could be carrying on 10 other conversations at the same time. I would say that I listen to no more than 25% of the conversations I have with anyone during the trading day. I would come in and out, buy and sell securities during any conversation. In an SEC deposition in 1982. During another investigation, Milken testified that he had about 500 phone conversations a day. And in a deposition in September 1986 he said he participated in, potentially 1,000 transactions every day. But this superhuman acceleration was not without its cost. If you talk to Michael for 3 or 4 minutes, said one associate, he can grasp what it may take other people hours or even a week to learn. But when you take 3 or 4 minutes down to 2 minutes, his reliability starts being worse. But he still wants to be in the decision process. Then he gives you 40 seconds, and his decisions are bad, made on too little input. Add to all that his imperialness and sense of his own infallibility. Out of about 30 or 40 conversations that this associate had with Milken on a given bond issue, he said they did not have more than 2 or 3 half-meaningful discussions. Most of those conversations lasted about 30 seconds. Conversations where you're on the phone with him and you don't know if he's listening to you or talking to someone else, covering the mouthpiece. You're talking, you niche making your point, and then he says, one of his most often used expressions, I'm back. By 1986, he concluded, Milken never had enough information. His retentive powers were amazing, but then that phenomenal repository got FILLED up, wasn't retaining any more. Some thought that Milken was increasingly out of touch, not only because he was operating at such velocity, but also because in his somewhat calmer moments off the trading floor he had succumbed to hubris. He had always cultivated a personal style that was modest, deferential. He liked to think that he appeared even humble. But years of rarely being challenged, of seeing his influence skyrocket, of having his acolytes and clients hang on his words, had taken their toll. So many treated him as though he were the oracle, and Milken began to act as though he were. Throughout 1985 and 1986, the chairman of American companies, not the Fortune 500, but sizable, $300 million companies, had been making the trek to Beverly Hills to pay homage. Milken would see almost no one during the trading day, so he scheduled these appointments before the market opened, starting at 4:30 a.m., and after its close. And there, in his throne room, he would finally forsake the 30-second bursts and segue into monologues on macroeconomics, on the state of the world, on whatever came into his imperial mind. On the final morning of the Tokyo Bond Conference in November 1986, the inaugural of Milken's effort to target Japan, having already captured so much of the domestic territory, Mike Mansfield, the crusty 87-year-old U.S. ambassador to Japan who had been a luncheon speaker at the Drexel Conference, invited Milken to a private breakfast meeting at the embassy. It was without specific purpose, a formal, courtesy visit. Such meetings have their own protocol. Polite conversation, phi-lled with give and take, not overextended. Milken, however, reportedly held forth for close to an hour in a monologue that barely allowed Mansef Ild to get a word in edgewise. Off and running, he is said to have pontificated until the visit's end on the economy, bonds, world politics, currency rates, macroeconomics. The gospel according to Milken. He had long been the fiscal evangelist, but now there was a self-importance which was blinding him, certainly to social conventions, and probably to much more. 15. Boesky Day. Drexel executives had just returned from the Tokyo Bond Conference in November, '86. Flushed with the success of that international inaugural. When, at the market's close on Friday, November 14, 1986, the day that they would thereafter refer to darkly as Boesky Day, the announcement came across the tape that Ivan Boesky had pleaded guilty to insider trading and had agreed to pay the largest fine ever, $100 million. He would, moreover, be cooperating with the government in its ongoing investigation of insider trading on Wall Street. At Drexel in New York, the leather-bound volumes of the $640 million much-disputed Boesky underwriting done in the spring of 1986 had been delivered that day to the OFF-ICE of Stephen Weinroth, the main investment banker on the deal, who would typically add these volumes to those of his other deals on his OFF-ICE shelves. Weinroth was not in the OFF-ICE. Hearing the news, his secretary put them in the closet. Over the next 4 months, Weinroth, who like several others is said to have argued against doing the Boesky underwriting, was responsible for its unwinding. In the end, the bondholders were made whole on their investment. It was Boesky's equity partners in his arbitrage fund who suffered losses, and who sued Boesky, Drexel, and Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver and Jacobson, the law firm that was counsel to Boesky in this and most other matters. When the unwinding was completed, in mid-March 1987, Drexel commemorated it not with the traditional deal paperweight, a lucite-encased miniature prospectus cover, but with a giant pink eraser, bearing the amount of the ill-fated offering in parentheses, $640 million. The Boesky-Milken relationship, however, was not so erasable. Within minutes of the announcement of Boesky's plea, the SEC issued subpoenas seeking information about trading in a dozen securities and the role in those transactions of Michael Milken, Carl Icahn, Victor Posner, Boyd Jefferies of the Los Angeles-based brokerage firm of Jefferies & Company, and others. Drexel executives knew then that their worst fears at the time of Dennis Levine's arrest in May, which had receded amidst the euphoria of the summer and fall of '86, had been realized. When Levine was arrested, the quick consensus at Drexel was that he would do anything, say anything, to save himself. He had been at Drexel for only a little over a year, however, and his colleagues in corporate finance in New York didn't think he had been close enough to Milken and his group to know much about what really went on in the Wild West. But what if he knew just a little? Or what if he made it up? Or what if he squealed on someone who did know? Through the summer, those whom Levine had earlier convinced to trade information with him, and whom he now was trading to the government, emerged to take their pleas. Investment bankers Ira Sokolow from Shearson Lehman Brothers, David Brown from Goldman Sachs, Robert Wilkes from Lazard Frères, and lawyer Elon Reich, Martin Lipton's protégé, from Wachtell, Lipton. With each successive revelation, however, the scandal seemed to move farther away from Drexel, becoming more and more the Wall Street scandal, and the Levine ring, moreover, appeared to have been comprised of second-tier M&A players. There was no hint of its touching the figure at the apex of that world. Then came Boesky. For years, other ARBs, investment bankers and traders had talked among themselves and, occasionally, on a background basis with this reporter and others about Boesky's trading on inside information. The shock that seized the street on November 14 was not at what Boesky had done, who had not surmised it, but at his having been caught. His prescient trading patterns had sparked SEC investigation after investigation, but until there was a cooperating witness in the person of Levine, the fortress had been impregnable. Now it was falling like a house of cards. Suddenly, most of Wall Street seemed vulnerable. Boesky, the biggest arb on the street by far, with hundreds of millions to bet, who lived and breathed the M&A game through all his frenetic, obsessive 21-hour days, had been at that game's nerve center. He had monitored it from his command post, where he stood for hours at a time, surrounded by computer screens flashing stock prices, manning a switchboard with 160 direct phone lines to stockbrokers, ARBs and others. There was not a significant M&A player on Wall Street who had not gotten the hyperkinetic Boesky's calls. And at least one star player, Martin Siegel when he was at Kidder, had long been rumored to have provided Boesky the inside information he continually sought. Now, like Levine, Boesky would doubtless offer up his Wilkises and Browns and Sokolos and Reiches. But just as Boesky had dwarfed them in Levine's trade, so would Boesky's ultimate target dwarf his middling ones. Because his ultimate target was the king. Boesky had been doing business with Milken since at least mid-1983, when Drexel raised $100 million for the Boesky-controlled Vagabond Hotels, a subsidiary of the Beverly Hills Hotel Corporation. In 1981, Boesky had gained control of the lush Beverly Hills Hotel from his in-laws after their patriarch, Ben Silberstein, died. In that vagabond offering, the proceeds of which were in part devoted to Boesky's risk arbitrage, Drexel in its time-honored tradition took as part of its fee a slug of warrants that gave it an equity stake in Vagabond, later renamed Northview Corporation. Then, in April 1984, Drexel had done a $109 million private placement of junk bonds for Boesky's arbitrage partnership. While $109 million seems paltry compared to the $640 million that Boesky would raise just 2 years later, at that time it probably comprised roughly 50% of his capital. So Boesky was relying heavily on Drexel for his funds. Interviewed in early 1984, Boesky's lawyer and close friend Stephen Frayden of Fried, Frank had listed Milken as one of a handful of people, important to Boesky, who knew him well. This friendship, or, more likely, this relationship based on mutual exploitation, since few more purposeful people than Boesky and Milken exist in this world, had begun even before Milken became the full-fledged maestro of the takeover world. But the relationship, and its potential for abuse, must have intensified once Milken possessed so much of the information the omnivorous Boesky craved. According to one associate of the two men, Boesky, who made it a point of pride that he slept only 3 or 4 hours a night, would call Milken, who did the same, most mornings as soon as Milken arrived at his desk, between 4 and 4:30 a.m. The relationship was fraught with a conference licit of interest potential that was extreme even for Milken. He, of course, would not have seen it as a conference licit. It had, rather, the synchronicity of interest that he had long cultivated in his interdependent universe, where he underwrote debt securities, and owned them, and owned those issuers' equity as well, and placed others' debt with those companies. Here Milken, and Drexel, not only underwrote Boesky's debt and probably owned some of it but had Professor IT participation in Boesky's arbitrage activities as equity holders. In those activities, Boesky was betting, in the kind of volume that could influence their outcomes, on the contests that Milken was strategizing and backing. They might be, if they so chose, perfectly complementary. And they had been, as Boesky began telling the government, or at least it appeared so from stories in the press, mainly those written by James Stewart and Daniel Hertzberg in the Wall Street Journal, during the 6 months after Boesky Day. Within the FIRST 2 weeks Drexel was identified as the subject of an investigation by the SEC and also a federal grand jury. By early February 1987, the outlines of what was reportedly the government's case were being sketched in the journal. The centerpiece of that case against Milken and others at Drexel appeared to be a $5.30 million payment made by a Boesky entity to Drexel in March 1986. As reported by Stewart and Hertzberg, that payment was questioned by Boesky's auditors at the accounting firm of Oppenheim, Apple, Dixon and Company. Boesky had told his auditors that it was for consulting. Unable to produce documentation explaining the payment, Boesky had then called Drexel's Beverly Hills ICE and obtained a letter, signed by Lowell Milken and Donald Balser, a member of the department, stating that the payment was for consulting and advisory services. Stewart and Hertzberg, however, quoted sources familiar with the government's case, who said that the payment appeared to be the settling of differences in a series of professor ITS and losses incurred by Boesky and Drexel, respectively. These professor ITS and losses apparently had resulted, sources said, from Boesky's having bought and parked stock at Milken's behest, and Milken's having done a similar favor for him. Parking refers to one investor's holding stock for another, in order to conceal the true ownership of the stock, and it typically involves the holders being guaranteed against losses. In some instances, these sources said, it appeared that Milken had not only agreed to protect Boesky from loss on the stock purchase Boesky made for him, but had promised him a percentage of the professor ITS on the eventual sale of the stock. Thus, to arrive at the $5.30 million, Boesky totaled the losses and professor ITS from the stock positions he had been parking for Drexel, and subtracted the percentage he was allowed to keep. If this were true, prosecutors would have a multitude of potential violations of the law to draw upon for indictments. Failure to disclose these arrangements in SEC filings, net capital violations, violation of prohibitions against market manipulation, of tender offer regulations, of record-keeping requirements, of prohibitions against falsifying documents, and of anti-fraud provisions of the securities laws, and conspiracy to commit any or all of these offenses. Beyond all this, if Boesky had parked stock for Drexel in the context of a coming takeover about which Drexel officials had inside information, then Drexel might be subject to triple damages under the Insider Trading Act for all or part of its professor ITS. There are numerous ways that such a reciprocal parking arrangement could have worked to Boesky's and Milken's mutual advantage. Boesky, who was always straining his net capital requirements with his gargantuan appetite, could have disguised the true magnitude of his holdings by parking them with Milken. Or he might not have wanted to make the required public 13D filing stating that he had acquired over 5% of a company's stock, if he were contemplating an acquisition. Boesky had said, in early 1984, that he intended to expand from arbitrage into merchant banking. Or he might have been buying stock on the basis of inside information about a coming deal, and he would have wanted to disguise his purchases so as to avoid SEC investigation. For his part, Milken might have wanted to park stock with Boesky if it were stock that Drexel was restricted from buying because of its knowledge of a coming deal. Or Milken might have wanted to seem not to own stock but have it on call to pressure a targeted hostile takeover subject as in, for example, the Wix situation. Or he might have wanted, as was allegedly the case in Victor Posner's acquiring control of Fischbach, to have freed Posner to act via a stock purchase, one he was unable to make himself. For Milken, deftly moving his players across the board, strategizing many moves ahead, The potential uses for disguised stock purchases were myriad. Fischbach was among the 8 stocks that Stewart and Hertzberg listed, in articles in the journal, as allegedly having been involved in the $5.30 million payment. The others were Gulf Plus Western, Unocal, Transworld, Phillips Petroleum, Diamond Shamrock, Lorimar Telepictures, Harris Graphics. According to Drexel executives, it was Fischbach that the government in depositions appeared to be focusing on the most. Indeed, in April 1987, when Boesky would take his criminal plea, having agreed to a consent decree regarding the SEC charges earlier, he would plead guilty to a criminal information that charged him with conspiring to make false statements to the SEC in the context of a conspiracy to gain control of Fischbach, an engineering company. The document charged that a conspirator had instructed Boesky to acquire Fischbach stock, and that Boesky was later reimbursed for losses as part of an attempt to reconcile other outstanding money differences. According to sources quoted by Stewart and Hertzberg, that conspirator was Milken, and that settling of differences was part of the $5.30 million payment. The Fischbach saga, which had been partially told, minus the alleged Milken-Boesky parking arrangement, by reporter Alan Sloan in the December 1985 Forbes, certainly looked like a classic Milken orchestration. It had begun back in 1983, when Victor Posner, then still a client in good standing at Drexel, and one of Milken's circle of high rollers, was being thwarted in his desire to gain control of Fischbach. Posner had entered into a standstill agreement with Fischbach in 1980 which prohibited his buying more than 24.9% of the company unless someone else acquired more than 10%. In December, 1983, Fred Carr of First Executive converted his Fischbach convertible bonds to stock, which gave him a 13.1% holding in the company. In January, 1984, Fischbach bought Carr out at the market price. In April, 1984, Posner sued Fischbach, claiming that Carr's holding had voided the standstill. Also in April, Boesky began acquiring Fischbach stock. By the summer, Boesky had acquired 13.4%. Posner, who now could argue that the standstill had been doubly voided, increased his stake in Fischbach to 28% and sought antitrust clearance to acquire more than 50%. Fischbach gave up the FI-GHT and agreed to give Posner control, once he had bought 51% of the company's shares. In February 1985, Drexel raised $48 million for Posner's Pennsylvania engineering. Also in February, Boesky sold all his Fischbach stock for $45 a share in London, when Fischbach was trading in the high 30s in New York. Boesky also sold Fischbach convertible debentures in the over-the-counter market at a premium over their face value. The same day, Pennsylvania Engineering purchased the identical number of shares, for $45 each, in the over-the-counter market, and the same amount of convertible debentures that Boesky had sold. The bulk of the $48 million Drexel raised for Pennsylvania Engineering was used to purchase these securities. Ultimately, Posner bought more than 50% of Fischbach stock. He became chairman of the company in October 1985. The Pennsylvania engineering underwriting occurred while Posner was struggling to raise money to take over National Can, and several months after Drexel executives said they had decided to raise no more money for Posner. One Drexel executive said, "It's true, we had made that decision. But the Pennsylvania engineering underwriting was for the Fischbach stock, and that whole thing had started before we made that decision, although it happened afterwards." It is true that Posner's Fischbach machinations predated the FI-RM's decision to raise no more funds for him, but that would in itself have been no reason for Milken and his investment banking colleagues to rescind their decision, unless they were already involved.
If the government is right in what it is alleging in the criminal information, of course, and assuming the conspirator is Milken, then they were.
According to the criminal information, and as agreed by Boesky in his guilty plea, Boesky was assured by the conspirators that he would be made whole on any losses resulting from his Fischbach stock purchases at the outset. Boesky also conference IRMED that the conspirators arranged for the purchase of the Boesky holdings at the above market price. Boesky took a loss on Fischbach, but it would have been much greater if he had not been able to sell to Posner at about 20% above market. With the Pennsylvania engineering underwriting, Posner got the money to acquire the company, and Milken got a way of cutting Boesky's losses, which he had allegedly guaranteed. Remember Milken's maneuverings, scouring the country for a buyer, finally settling on Peltz when no one else was willing, raising all the money for the acquisition, to rescue Posner from the trap he found himself in at National Can, and the government's Fischbach scenario becomes utterly credible. It is, in fact, vintage Milken. At the controls, fine-tuning here, adjusting there, advancing his players, using them to pressure some reluctant party, moving one to help another, fiercely intent, always, on expanding his scope, and maintaining the delicate equilibrium of the interconnected whole. Ironically, all the machinations were for no Professor I table end. The Pennsylvania engineering debt, raised at rates of 17% to 22%, coincided with a slump in that company's main business, making the interest payments crippling. Fischbach's construction business suffered at the same time, so that it was unable to help with those interest payments. Professor I table when Posner Phi RST targeted it, Fischbach's earnings were $26.70 million in 1983, its peak year. Fischbach lost $29 million in 1986. And by mid-1987 the downward spiral of Posner's empire had accelerated, accentuating the wisdom of Drexel's decision in the fall of '84 to do no more financings for him, a decision that Drexel executives must fervently wish they had adhered to. Sometimes, as seems to have been true in Fischbach, the actions performed by Milken's machine, in its diverse parts, were complex. Sometimes they were brutally simple. Milken's apparent use of Steinberg as a club to gain Wicks's business was an example of the latter. As was the attempted extortion that Staley Continental alleges took place in November 1987, just days before Boesky Day, when Milken's troops had no idea the end was near and so appear to have been carrying on business as usual in the department. In February '87, Staley Phi led suit against Drexel, alleging that Drexel had made an extortionate attempt to force Staley to use it as an investment banker so that Staley could be taken over by a Drexel-Staley management leveraged buyout group. The suit was proceeding along its private, civil track, but Drexel executives said that it had obviously aroused government interest, as the SEC in its depositions was focusing intensively on Staley also. According to one former Drexel executive, Drexel had attempted to court the blue-chip food company Staley as a client in the early '80s, through a contact at Bruxelles Lambert, but had been rebuffed. The Drexel of the mid-'80s, however, was not so easily discouraged. The Staley suit alleges that Drexel and some of its customers began making purchases of Staley stock in late October '86. On November 3, it says, a representative of Drexel contacted Staley's chief financial officer, Robert Hoffman, and expressed an interest in establishing an investment banking relationship. 3 days later, the person in charge of accumulating Staley stock at Drexel, Milken's favored salesman trader James Dahl, also a central figure in the Beverly Hills savings and loan suit against Drexel, allegedly told Hoffman that Drexel had acquired approximately 1.5 million shares, more than 5% of the company's stock, and might buy more. Dahl is said to have advised Hoffman against Staley's doing a planned common stock offering. On November 11, the complaint continues, Dahl suggested a management-led leveraged buyout to Hoffman. He also warned against Staley's proceeding with its planned stock issue with any investment banker but Drexel. On November 13, Staley registered a 4 million share offering with the SEC, with Merrill Lynch and First Boston as lead managers. Dahl allegedly threatened to disrupt the offering, and over the next several days heavy selling forced Staley's stock price down $5. Drexel sold into our offering, Staley's general counsel, Robert Scott, told the Wall Street Journal. On November 21, Staley withdrew the offering and led with the SEC for a new issue of preferred stock. Additional costs associated with this revised deal were $70 million, for which Staley was suing Drexel, as compensatory damages. It was also suing for twice that in punitive damages. At least as provocative as what Drexel did, as alleged in the Staley complaint, is what Dahl said. He allegedly acknowledged that Drexel had not yet led a 13D. Despite the fact that he said the firm owned more than 5% of Staley's stock. 13Ds, he explained, were bad for business. In assuring Hoffman that Drexel was genuinely interested in pursuing a leveraged buyout of Staley with its management, Dahl allegedly explained that Drexel drew no distinction between debt and equity because companies' life cycles were so short, and that Drexel could take Staley private in 48 hours. In warning Hoffman against Staley's doing the common stock offering, Dahl allegedly said, "It is very important for us to sit down and talk before you do something that hurts me and before I do something that hurts you." The equity offering, Dahl allegedly made plain, would hurt Drexel by diluting the value of its holdings, and if that happened, the next thing that happens is someone files a 13D at $40 a share and management is thrown out. Later, after Staley had decided to go ahead with the offering, Dahl allegedly asked how its pricing would be handled and commented that he would hate to see Drexel have to sell into the offering. This was the Drexel, the brass knuckles, threatening, market-manipulating Cosa Nostra of the securities world, that its rival investment bankers and corporate targets loved to hate. Drexel was already down, 3 months into the government investigation, when the Staley suit was led, but a round of cheers went up in the investment banking community. Just as rivals had circulated copies of the Green Tree complaint when it had been led, so now, Drexel executives alleged, Solomon sent its clients copies of the Staley complaint. To many who knew Dahl, his alleged comments rang with authenticity. Seeming not only literally but symbolically true, they captured the zeitgeist of the Beverly Hills operation. While these acquaintances of Dahl speculated that he might have been off on an entrepreneurial spree, unauthorized by Milken, they agreed that it was the kind of action that the culture of the department encouraged. One former Drexel employee claimed, "What Jim Dahl is alleged to have said was not the exception in Beverly Hills, but the norm." Moreover, it seems unlikely that Milken, who was obsessed with controlling his people and everything that he touched, who in an SEC deposition several years earlier had spoken about his gradually developed ability to hear everything that went on his trading floor, would have utterly missed Dahl's machinations in Staley. As one former member of this group declared, Mike controlled everything. He was like Patton, up on the hill. He saw everything that went on, heard everything. Drexel took the position publicly that the suit was totally without merit. According to one Drexel employee, the FIREM's officials to whom Staley complained in November decided that Dahl had said some things that were inappropriate, and they hastened to reassure Staley that Drexel would do nothing to destabilize the company. Drexel and Staley were in the midst of executing a standstill agreement, this executive says, when Staley suddenly led suit. This executive also adds that Drexel was a net buyer, not seller, during the Staley aborted offering. Therefore, he states, Dahl was all talk and no action. Drexel did not ruin the stock offering, and there were no grounds for a suit. Even if Drexel did not carry out Dahl's alleged threats, the Staley situation exemplified, in this writer's view, conduct that was probably central to the Milken machine and that could be a 13D violation. Assembling control of more than 5% of the stock but not disclosing it publicly while using it as a threat privately. Milken was the great choreographer. He knew where convertible bonds were and where lots of stocks were, or he could advise clients to buy them and then he could bring their cumulative weight to bear, all without filing a 13D and disclosing that these shares were being used in concert to achieve his end. From his earliest days as a bond trader, when his fellow bondholders typically were a passive lot, Milken had understood that controlling a position of size in a company's securities, even its debt securities, meant a chance to exert control over that company. He had tried this with Rickless, in Rapid American, and been well received. He had tried this with Sigaloff, in Dalen, and not been. The Milken who years later reportedly told Sigaloff, in Wix, that, with the stock that others held but he controlled, he effectively had control of the company, was simply a Milken who had grown far more powerful, who could direct the movement of stocks owned by others, but it was the same Milken. In addition to looking for evidence of Drexel's having assembled blocks of stock without complying with disclosure requirements, and of its having parked stocks to disguise their true ownership, the government also appeared, during the first few months of '87, to be looking for evidence of the more garden variety misuse of inside information. Passing inside information about coming deals to favored customers was something for which the SEC had investigated Milken in earlier years, always fruitlessly. According to press reports, the government had subpoenaed both Rodrigo Rocha and Guy Dove, attempting to ascertain whether Atlantic Capital, on tips from Drexel, had invested in common stocks before announced tender offers. If true, this would have given Atlantic Capital added motivations, beyond the high yield of the bonds, for being probably the single largest subscriber to the junk bonds in the 1985 takeovers. It would have had a powerful interest in the deals going through, since it was a shareholder in the target company, and it would also be repaying the favors of Drexel's tips. As the investigation continued, the government would become interested in another satellite group with which Milken had done business, the Regan-Thorpe entities. James Regan and Edward Thorpe and their associates had been Milken's partners at least since the Treasury's stripping days of Dorchester Government Securities and Belvedere Securities, and they had been a focus of SEC interest in the 1985 investigation into the trading of Caesars World Securities. In December 1987, federal agents would raid and confiscate more than 60 boxes of documents and business records going back to January 1984 from 3Phi RMS, which operated from the same address in Princeton, New Jersey. Princeton Newport Arbitrage Partners, Englewood Partners and the Oakley Sutton Management Corporation. According to search warrant filings, the government was hoping to establish that a network of traders had been involved in a scheme of stock parking. It also sought evidence of improper tax deductions taken on losses that were generated from hedging on trades involving convertible bonds and warrants, according to the court documents. Among those named in the warrant was Bruce Newberg, who had been a trader in convertibles for Milken and was still a member of Milken's group though no longer on the trading desk. In the early months of the investigation, however, it had not seemed plausible that it would continue for over a year without producing indictments. Nearly every Friday in March and April of 1986, Wall Street gossip had predicted that the Milken and Drexel indictments would be announced at the market's close, gossip fueled, of course, by press reports which purported to spell out the government's impending case against Drexel in great detail. While those reports were not borne out within the 6 months following Boesky Day, other events had occurred. Boesky, to the surprise of few on the street, had offered up Martin Siegel. On February 13, Siegel had pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of tax evasion and conspiracy to violate securities laws, and also agreed to pay $9 million in civil fines. The insider trading with Boesky to which he pleaded, however, had occurred while he was at Kidder, before he went to Drexel. Siegel, in turn, had offered up Robert Freeman, head of the arbitrage department at the impeccable Goldman Sachs. Richard Wigton, head of arbitrage at Kidder, Peabody, and Timothy Tabor, former head of arbitrage at Merrill Lynch. These 3 men were arrested the day before Siegel took his plea, and they were charged with being part of an information-swapping conspiracy. But, by May their indictments had been dropped. On March 20, Boyd Jefferies, chairman of Jefferies Group, the Los Angeles-based brokerage firm that had become a major force in takeovers, pleaded to 2 felony counts of securities law violations, and settled related charges with the SEC relating to market manipulation and to parking stock in a scheme with Boesky. By April 1, the opening day of the 1987 Predators Ball, it seemed to many Drexel employees and their clients that the government's drumbeat was almost deafening. Freeman, Wigton and Tabor had been arrested without warning. Wigton led from his Kidder off ICE in handcuffs, and the nightmare of some at Drexel was of Milken being arrested on stage at the Predators Ball. The conference drew a record crowd, some probably out of curiosity but many out of loyalty. Fred Joseph appeared ill and suddenly aged. Other Drexel executives were depressed and fatigued. Carrie Maltish looked especially haggard. Maltish was the Drexel off ICL, formerly in Beverly Hills but now based in New York, who according to sources quoted by Stewart and Hertzberg handled all Milken's personal trading and, at the end of each day, destroyed computer printouts of his trades in a shredder. The mood at the Polo Lounge, where for the Phi RST time Engel's girls were absent, was wake-like. It's because of the First Amendment, one Drexel executive explained sourly, referring to press reports. Milken alone looked well. He did not introduce as many of the client presentations as he had done in years past, having accepted the view of Joseph and others that for the good of the firm he should recede somewhat at this conference lest he soon have to recede forever. But when he mounted the stage at the Beverly Hilton during the closing gala, his loyalists, over 2,000 strong, gave him an ovation that seemed as if it would never end. 16. The center cannot hold. In the 6 months that followed Boesky Day, Drexel was a reminder of the old adage that the higher they rise, the harder they fall. The heights that Drexel's executives had scaled had been so dizzying, and their descent was now so sudden, that some felt themselves on a roller coaster. Many at Drexel looked for the root of their downfall outside. The press, mainly the Wall Street Journal, which, shortly after Boesky Day, had begun to describe in increasingly greater detail Milken, Drexel, and Milken's takeover machine as targets of the investigation, was one scapegoat. The government, as personified chief ly in the SEC and the U.S. Attorney's Office ICE, one or both of which was presumed to be leaking to the press, and secondarily in a newly aroused Congress, was another. America's corporate elite, those business roundtable types who had fought the hated Drexel and their Araviste clients on every possible front, in Congress, in court, at the Fed, and lost, but who now saw a chance to reverse that rout, was a third. And Drexel's investment banking rivals on the street, who had marshaled much of corporate America's attack on the upstart firm but in the end had decided to play its game, were yet a fourth. The more conspiracy-minded at Drexel saw combinations of the four, in unholy league. The distortions and even falsehoods being uttered about our Phi Erm and some of its personnel are so rampant and willful that one wonders if it isn't a plot to destroy us, wrote Tubby Burnham, the then 77-year-old honorary chairman of the board, in an anguished letter to Drexel Burnham employees 10 days after Boesky Day. Arthur Bilger, corporate finance partner in Beverly Hills, spoke for many of his colleagues when he pointed out that, between 20 and 25% of Fortune 500 companies disappeared in 1986. I am convinced that it is that, generally, plus our having gone after the major oil companies, Gulf, Phillips and Unocal, that has caused our troubles. Others at Drexel saw the backlash springing from a resentment more deep-rooted and age-old. Now they harked back to the fears expressed by many Jewish members of the business establishment ever since Drexel had Phi RST conjured up its armies of takeover entrepreneurs. Paul Levy, one of Drexel's 3.9 unregistered exchange offer specialists, put it bluntly. There is a lot of anti-Semitism at work, Levy declared. People see Drexel as a bunch of Jewish guys who have been making too much money. Amidst all the talk of persecution, however, there was a certain amount of self-examination and recrimination. What the aftermath of Boesky Day made crystal clear was that Drexel had no friend on the street. In the early 80s, as its junk business flourished, the Phi Erm had been disdained by Wall Street's titans. Not hated, but disdained. Once Drexel had become a titan itself, it had seemed to take pleasure in remaining the outsider, in fluid outing the rules of the fraternity, in crushing that fraternity's members when it could. Other FIRMS syndicated